I welcome everyone on our 51st author interaction with none other than Vikram Sampath, author of the book Savarkar, A Contested Legacy, 1924 to 1966, which is the second and concluding part of the biography series published by Penguin Random House. Savarkar, The Echoes from a Forgotten Past, was the first in the series. Through these two volumes, Vikram has tried to explore the life and times of Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who definitely is one of the contentious and debated personalities in contemporary Indian history. So, welcome, Vikram, for the second time, and it has been almost a year since we last had the opportunity to interact with you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, Neeta, and good evening to everyone who's joined. I think a year passes so quickly, and lots has changed in the country, and I think in all our personal lives. And in the midst of it, there's a book to share with all of you. As you rightly mentioned, this concludes. It almost feels like a task that. A huge task I feel personally, satisfied to have completed, to bring to perspective and to a modern reader today, the life, the times, the philosophy of this much, misunderstood and maligned patriot, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. I think there was a need to reevaluate characters of our past, which we hadn't done in his case. So hopefully it's a small, humble attempt at course correction in history.
Thank you so much again for joining, Vikram. And it is so nice to see you fit and fine. And as I just mentioned before the conversation, you almost gave us quite a big scare. So, before losing time, because there are a lot of people also waiting in the interactive round, I must tell everyone to please put your questions in the chat box. We might be taking some very nice ones at the end after the interactive round. So, I will really dive into our conversation right away. Vikram, you've authored 5 books. You're a doctorate in history and music, besides being an engineer, mathematician, and an MBA finance. And you have given so many bestsellers year after year. So, what gives you so much of strength to turn everyone literary and everything into a success, as it always is?
I don't know what the strength is. I think it's some grace of the one above. and I think most often I say rather eerily that, I don't choose the subjects for my books, particularly the biographies I write. They come choosing me. I know it sounds very spooky and eerie, but that's how it's been, whether it was the case of Gohar Jan, on whom I wrote, also Dr. S. Balachandar, or now Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. So, and the first book on the Vodeyars of Mysore. All of these were very, very serendipitous, never planned kind of, books that I wrote saying, this is what I need to do, or I don't even go with the idea that this needs to sell well and become like a lot of, I think, writers and authors today are quite obsessed about marketing strategies and sales numbers. I really just, with supreme trust in the universe and my readers, I just, it's a free fall. Sometimes it works. Many times it's failed also. But then, I've just been, I think, lucky since some time, particularly with subjects like this, where, as I said, there is a thirst among the readers for people who are either, forgotten in history or who are maligned purposely. Then there's a curiosity that builds up, among the readers, that what is it about this person that raises so much heckles, or what is it that we don't know about this person? And so then, it becomes so much easier for people to want to read a little more about that person.
Fantastic. And this is the book that we are talking about today. It does seem like quite a big book, but it is a very interesting read, very simple. You can just not put it down. And this has been published by Penguin Random House. You can always order it on Amazon, buy it in some select bookstores all over. So, Vikram, how does it feel to be out with your dream book? It has been in limelight ever since it has come out. You've been giving all interviews and people have been wanting to hear you. And it has indeed been creating waves. So do you feel satisfied or a little nervous about how it is going to be?
To be honest, Neeta, before I started the journey, I was still okay. My mother was very, very apprehensive because, in the past, I've written things which have caused quite a lot of trouble, in society. I'd written on Tipu Sultan, and I'd also given a few lectures here in Bangalore, which caused a lot of furor, considering, the live battlefield that history becomes, or anything to do about history becomes. My lectures had been shouted down. My effigy was also burnt here in Bangalore, in the heart of the city. And so my mother was then rather scared that a person like Savarkar, who is so contested and so contentious, do you really want to put your time and effort into this work? But I was very resolute. And then at the same time, there was also a lot of while in the other characters like Gohar Jan, etc., there was very paucity of material. I didn't know how to get material research, because at Tawayev's life you hardly have much documented sources. But in this case, there was a problem of plenty. There was just so much of material. It was a mountain of archival documents from not only India, but from across the world. And so for a long time, there was also this diffidence whether I'm even capable of putting this all together into a narrative, which was cogent and coherent. And I remember what my mother had told me then. She gave an analogy of mountain climbing. And she said that, when you're climbing a mountain, don't keep looking up when you're trekking Mount Everest, thinking, oh my God, there's so much more to go, or turn back and see there's so much you've traversed. Just take one little step at a time, live in the present moment, so to say. And then before you realize, you would have reached the summit. And so I kept that. Of course, in the process in the journey of the writing of the book, I lost my mother, but who was to be my research assistant, so to say, in this journey. She was very good at Marathi, and so she could have helped me, with some of the original documents. But then these words of advice from her, they stayed on with me. And every time this problem of plenty confounded me, saying, how do I even deconstruct the life of someone so complicated? There are so many aspects to his life. There's so many contradictions. This one advice stuck on. And I took every chapter, every episode of his life step by step. And before I realized, voila, it was over. And now for a long time, it's also a sense of void that most biographers feel, because you're so emotionally invested with that person that once it's over, you need to move on to another project. Otherwise, you feel so empty from within. And also the very important requirement for a biography is, while you're so invested emotionally with the character, you're also supposed to, or called upon to, take a very cold, rational, unemotional, view of the person. Otherwise, there's a very thin line between a biography and a hagiography. And particularly in a case like Savarkar, who's so maligned, the temptation to become his lawyer and defend everything is very, very high. So to keep those temptations away and to try to the maximum extent to make, a very objective assessment of his life. That's what I've tried to do. I've also brought out many of his failings, and also in the process, yes, of course, answered all the allegations. So yeah, it does feel like exorcising a ghost. It's a hugely satisfying experience, and I do hope the readers to receive it in similar way.
I must say that you will always have blessings of your mother, always, and she is looking over you. And that's why, this book is really, really, really anticipated, and people really, really are appreciating the kind of hard work, the kind of research, and the way you've written the book.
Thank you.
Congratulations to you once again.
Thank you.
Vikram, getting into the book, and one of the questions which most of my viewers also had been, posting to me, that they really want to know, and I know you've been asked this question before several times, but what was Savarkar's vision of India, knowing that he was one of the most consequential ideologues and thought leaders of his time and had pride in his nation? So what was his vision like? What did he want of India? He did what he did finally.
I think that's an important question to ask. And,
Yes.
I've often said, instead of me, talking about that, it's best we hear it from the man himself. He died in February 1966, but then just a few months before, in October or November, during the Diwali of 1965, he was interviewed by the RSS mouthpiece, or the organizer. And among several questions that were asked of him was exactly this question that you just asked me, saying, what is India of your dreams? And I think it's best we hear it in first person rather than my summarization of that. He says, and I quote, "My India would be a democratic state in which people belonging to different religions, sects, or races would be treated with perfect equality. None would be allowed to dominate others. None would be deprived of his just and equal rights of free citizenship, so long as everyone discharged the common obligation which he owed to the state as a whole. Hindustan, the motherland and the holy land of the Hindus, from the Indus to the seas, would be an organic, undivided state. The Hindus would be a casteless society, a consolidated and a modern nation. Science and technology would be encouraged. There would be a total liquidation of landlordism. All the land would belong to the state eventually. All key industries would be nationalized. India would be self-sufficient in respect of food, clothes, shelter, and defense. The India of my dreams would have unbounded faith in a world commonwealth because the earth is the common motherland of all. But India would not go down under the evolution of this world commonwealth. The foreign policy of a militarily strong Akhand Hindustan would be a policy of neutrality and peace, and a powerful centralized state of Hindustan would contribute effectively towards an enduring peace and prosperity in the world," unquote. So, it talks in detail. Of course, the economic policies would not be in consonance with what we perhaps believe, today. There's a lot of stress on socialism, and that was a theme of the times, nationalization, where everything, industries were also to be nationalized, capital, labor, everything in the hands of the government, which is supreme. But then on several other fronts, on the social front, advocating a casteless society, a complete eradication of all caste differences, equality of people of all religions. So truly secularism as is embodied by the meaning of that term, and a militarily strong India, which I think is important, again, in today's context, where national security and defense and external affairs too, where one is looking not as on some esoteric principles of foreign policy, but then be pragmatic there too. Whoever is India's friend is a friend, no matter what ideology or whatever they might follow, because that doesn't really matter. If they're a friend, there are no permanent enemies or friends, as they say in external affairs, only permanent national interests. So I think a lot of these aspects of his vision of India, if we actually see, a lot of it seems to have fructified today as the India of today as well, though we may not give credit to him for that.
I've always read that, you don't want to be judgmental about him, or you don't want to kind of promote him. Yeah. But I vote from you because somehow I feel you are really one of the very few people in India who knows him so well. So what are the few sentences you would like to describe Veer Savarkar today, in today's context? And how would he fare against the present political scenario if he was alive today? And which political ideology do you think he'll follow?
Oh God, that's a tough question. I hope there's some politician among the people who are there who is not going to take offense. But well, I would call him as a visionary, a thinker, an ideologue. But at the same time, I would also not rate him very high as a leader, because, a mass leader, so to say, because, he was ideally a very, someone like whom you interview on your show, the writer. Writers are very, beings who are very introverted, introspective. They like to be secluded, do their work. Such people, to put them at the helm of affairs, to lead a political party, I think it would be quite disastrous. And barring a few exceptions, like say Atalji or someone who was a poet and also a politician and a prime minister, there would be very few people who are at helm of affairs who are also into literature and who have an active thinking mind. So to that extent, he was a huge misfit, because I don't think he managed to even create a consensus within his own party, the Hindu Mahasabha that he led. There were so many factional feuds between him and his protege, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, till the time, of course, Mukherjee finally broke away from the Hindu Mahasabha and formed the Jan Sangh and branched away. So could not convince, while he was far ahead of his times, progressive in his thoughts, some of which cannot even be accepted in India today in 2021. To talk about that in the 1920s and 30s, much to the anger of the orthodoxy and the society of then, it was really being a visionary in that sense. But then to be a leader, you have to be like a Gandhi. You have to take people along. You have to convince them. You have to play to the galleries. You have to be able to convince everyone, which probably he somewhere did not manage. So to that extent, I don't know how he would fare in any political setup today, considering the competitiveness of the field today. Those days, there were just three parties, the main parties, the Congress, the Muslim League, and the Hindu Mahasabha. Even within that, there was so much of a difficulty for him to survive. Beyond 5-6 years,
Yes.
he almost got out of the party. So today's competitive electoral politics and all these different vote banks and the agendas that go on, I'm sure he may not have fitted in any party, and I'm making it across the board, not any one particular ideology. But I think as I mentioned earlier, the current dispensation, the ruling dispensation, draws a lot from him. I mean the personal respect that even the Prime Minister, shows on him, the way he went to the cellular jail and offered his obeisances to Savarkar. Very few, no other Prime Minister in the past perhaps has done that. And so to that extent, and a lot of these other, the strong militaristic India, and an India which will not hold an olive to a enemy which is not going to listen to you. They're going to try for peace, but if they continue to strike at you, then you're going to strike back. It's not going to be the principle that for every slap I'll give you my other cheek. So his
Very
book
different.
So his book of his London days was called Shatruncha Shibirat, inside the enemy camp. So Shatru ke ghar ke andar ghus ke unko maro. So I think a lot of things that happened with, say, Balakot or whatever, these are echoes of the same ideas, I would say. And also many of his agendas, like equality in front of law, particularly when it comes to women, the abolition of triple talaq, the abrogation of Article 370, which has been almost a fundamental principle with the Indian political right, whether it was Savarkar and more so with Shama Prasad Mukherjee, who gave up his life for this cause. I think a lot of those are drawing from his ideas, though he will not be given credit for that directly. So maybe he might have veered more towards the current ruling dispensation, but how much he would survive there is anybody's guess.
Very well said, but one thing which really troubled me recently, and I was very excited about it when BJP announced and proposed that he'll get Bharat Ratna for bravery for his participation in India's independence struggle. But still nothing happened, even if the government does support him some way or the other. Why do you think he's still being ignored after so many years, and after the narrative being told? Even, your book tells us a different side of him. A lot of people are still convinced, but they're not able to take that extra step in kind of honoring him with a Bharat Ratna. So why do you think it happens, and what are your views on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as I said, he's become such a ironically, a person who fought all his life against social untouchability is a political untouchable today. So everybody picks and chooses those aspects of his life which suit them, either to deride him or to appropriate him. And so it is with and I don't blame any political party, because they're all there to fight a very bitter struggle against each other. So even the current dispensation would not completely accept or appropriate his legacy. They would like to cherry pick some of the things, because many of the things he said on caste or on cow worship and so on would be something that even people in the present dispensation may not kind of agree completely. It raises so much heckles even today with all the lynchings and all of that happened. So I think this openness to embrace him, they always fall back on, and he becomes a subject nonetheless of election manifestos where promises are made in Maharashtra. If they voted to power, the BJP would give them, give him the Bharat Ratna. In fact, in my book launch, it was Uddhav Thackeray then, who was not yet the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, who made this statement that he needs to get the Bharat Ratna. And he said many other things also, which caused the news shutters to go on for several days, that if Mani Shankar Iyer comes to Mumbai, he's going to beat him up with slippers and all of that. Of course, later on, he did realize that he would be in alliance with the same party he was castigating. That's the terrible irony of politics. So all these reasons put together, perhaps, people fall short. But honestly, Neeta, I think these things don't matter. I mean, there are many. Gandhi ji also is not a Bharat Ratna, but then there are characters like Gandhi, Savarkar, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, all of them who are probably beyond these labels and awards. I think the awards would be honored if it's given to some, people like this. And again, to an extent of a course correction, where, all these awards, we've just seen what's happened with the Khel Ratna award as well. Appropriation again by one group or one ideology or one family, to the extent of removing that stranglehold over national honors. To that extent, I very much support and welcome, the conferment of the Bharat Ratna on him. But otherwise, it hardly matters to him or even his family. They've said we don't care much because, we've suffered so much, and we've been also, let alone be recognized, we're actually maligned all the time. So it doesn't matter much.
I totally understand. It's just that I know sometimes awards don't matter, but it becomes kind of a stepping stone to kind of give recognition to somebody who deserves it after so many years. And after reading your narrative and your books, we realize that he should be, where he belongs. Before I delve into my conversation further, I have a very, very special guest, Tuhin Sinha, who's just joined in. And I think he's in between his debates, so I'll take him on. He's the national BJP spokesperson and a very, very renowned TV panelist, and he's been the author of several books, including Mission Shenzhen, and he was recently on our forum also. So good evening, Tuhin. Thank you for joining on a very important discussion.
Good evening, Neeta ji. Good evening, Vikram.
Hello, Tuhin. Good evening.
How are you doing? Many congratulations on this lovely book. So when Neeta ji asked me to join, I thought there's no way I'm going to miss this one. So in between the debates, so, the best thing that I like about rewriting history is that it requires enormous conviction, because we've all grown up, I remember, and I believe we must be the same age, roughly the same age. We've all grown up believing that certain people, we've all grown up in a somewhat semi-colonial mindset, believing that the heroes who were thrust upon us were the real heroes, and we were taught not to respect certain people. In fact, the political loser, the biggest political loser, still, repeats those errors. So he keeps wanting the country to believe that Savarkar was a coward. For that matter, he likes to believe everybody is a coward. So where did this idea in you emanate? I mean, what was the trigger? Because like I said, it requires a lot of courage to not just go against the tide and rewrite history, but also to create a situation where publishers, who would have otherwise not agreed to publish it maybe 5 years ago. So tell us about this journey. Yeah, I'm still, in the initial pages, unfortunately. So I'll specifically ask you about the book on a later date.
Thank you, Tuhin, and lovely to meet you. Though we've never met in person so far, which is such a tragedy. But at least on the virtual platform, it's great to catch up. And that's as a writer, I think you'd get the the whole problem and the conundrum of getting a good publisher all the time. So bang on where you say, even 10 years ago or 5 years ago, finding a mainstream publisher like Penguin or anyone else for on Savarkar would have been almost unthinkable. But, my interest in him was peaked during the Vajpayee era, when his photograph came up in the Central Hall of Parliament, and then of course the entire ruckus that was created by Mani Shankar Iyer, where the plaque in his honor at Cellular Jail was removed, and he had all these charitable things to say. And so Savarkar was all the time ruminating in my mind. And my mother, having been a Maharashtrian herself, a lot of family stories were around Savarkar. In fact, her family were also distant relatives of hers were also victims of the anti-Brahmin carnage that the Congress committed in Maharashtra in the aftermath of Gandhi's murder, very similar to what happened in Delhi against the Sikhs. So I've been hearing all these stories from her, and there was something enigmatic about this person who, curiously, I'm sure, even when you read your history books in school, he never made an appearance, or even a cursory appearance. At least in the CBSE textbooks I studied, there was no reference to Savarkar. So it was a lot of rumination about him, trying to find out little details, and then the actual project kicked off about 5 to 6 years back. And in these 6 years, I've just been totally immersed in trying to find out every possible detail that I could, or lay my hands on, whether it is, regional literature in Marathi or other languages of India, or archives both within and outside India, to kind of reconstruct what you rightly put, the narrative of history, which has been a very, very simplistic, linear, monochromatic, dinned down our throats for several generations now. And now, with 75 years of freedom, at least now I think we are mature enough as a democracy to be able to acknowledge the fact that there was not just one strain of freedom movement or a freedom struggle. There were parallel narratives. There were multiple paths that went to that freedom, and not all of them were non-violent. Without disparaging, the main movement, whether there were tribal revolts, there were sannyasi rebellions, there was, the armed struggle right from 1857 to the naval mutiny. We still call it a mutiny of Bombay in 1946, which actually helped us get freedom eventually, and not several of the other things that we are actually told to believe, celebrate, commemorate, and so on. So I think we are mature now as a democracy to see these narratives, and the environment in the country too, thanks to probably the politics around or whatever, is fertile to at least listen to this. And that's the best part, where it's not about, of course, you are completely affiliated to a political party, so I would not make you say anything uncomfortable which will cause you to be in trouble. But then it's irrespective of who's in power or which party is in power. I think the awakening among people, which is more important, which has come, that we're not going to take things lying down. We're not going to take whitewashing of our history lying down, whether it's the freedom movement, whether it's the invasions, and world over, decolonial scholarship is something that's gaining ground. So why not in India? Why is that looked upon as revisionism, as chauvinism, and all kinds of names that are put on it? So I think the environment is fertile, where irrespective of what happens politically, a lot of people are open to this idea. And that's why historians like me can stick our neck out and take the risk to write the truth as we see it.
Great. So there are two things I just wish to add over here. See, honestly, I don't think political parties have been very consistent in their approach towards Savarkar. And that includes all parties. And you just mentioned the trigger, Mani Shankar Iyer abusing him. So the party which had protested the most, Shiv Sena, today, today is in cahoots, or today has joined the same party which abuses Savarkar Day in India. And of course, in the last 20 years, I think the BJP also probably today shows a greater acceptance, or is more upfront about embracing Savarkar than it had been before. The second thing you just mentioned, which is actually very interesting, the parallel streams of a freedom movement. So in fact, I have been working on a similar subject, which involves subaltern history. So in fact, our freedom struggle goes way back till about 1765. 1857 is what we have again been made to believe. So anyway, coming to the next question, what next from here? Two parts of Savarkar. What's the next big thing that, part of history that you wish to rewrite?
Actually, three. So
Wonderful.
signed up for 3 books with Penguin, and so 2
Super.
are, of course, Landmines, the biographies of again very contentious and contested figures who are very relevant in politics today, Tipu Sultan and Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but before that, by the time of the 75th year, I'd also want to bring out an anthology of about 18 lives of unsung heroes and heroines from different parts of India and across different time spans, which busts the narrative that we have been a country only of losers. A history textbook is like a litany, laundry list of all wars we lost, right? From the Battle of Tarain to the, 1857 to everything. So there must have been some war, some resistance we put, some wars we won for the fact that we are still around as a civilization. So who are these heroes who led this? Who are the heroines? What is the story of women? And the history of India is not the history of only Delhi and Delhi-centric kingdoms. The northeast of India, the south of India, the western part of India hardly features in the history of historiography of India. So something to represent different parts of the country, and also the stories of women, the stories of valor, the stories of resistance. I think a small tribute by the time of our 75th year of independence is what I'm planning to put together.
Great. So I will look forward to these books. I wish you more power, and I wish more and more readers embrace these subjects. Thank you, Neetaji.
Thank you.
I'll catch up with you.
Yeah.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. Fantastic. That was a lovely conversation. Yes. Next we have, because one of the questions Tuhin asked was one of my questions. So I'll put on to Shashwat Pandey now. He's going to be a big surprise for you. He's your youngest fan. He's all of 12 years.
Oh my God, yes.
He's read your books, you know him, right?
I really admire this kid. Hello, Shashwat. And I loved the way you held both the books in your hand and your mother took a picture of that.
Yes.
And I don't think you will have to go to the gym too often if you keep practicing with them as dumbbells.
He's got keen interest in Indian history and culture. He's been reading extensively, in particular about the Maratha history, and is highly inspired by the lives of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and the Peshwas. Over to you, Shashwat, for your questions.
Namaste, sir. So my first question to you is that, as we all know, that Hedge Varji has such a big impact on modern India. But Savarkar has been comparatively as not even close to that impact on modern India as to Hedge Varji and other leaders in common. So, sir, what are your thoughts on that?
Before I answer your question, let me ask you one question. You read both the books, or you've read a lot of the second book. What aspects of the book did you like? Or what aspect of Savarkar did you like as a reader and as our youngest reader in this whole room today?
So in the first volume, I liked how how he braved the tortures in the the Kalapani, and also his secret Abhinav Bharat Society, and all his covert activities in the India House in London. And I have read, I am on the 5th chapter of second book. So, sir, until then, you have done a really good compilation of all the facts of his life until then. After his release from the prison to house arrest, I have just completed until that part. And sir, so I have liked these things about the book and Savarkar.
How sweet. Thank you. Thank you so much. And your mother had also said that your expressions when you read out Abdul Rashid, my dear brother, were also quite, for those who don't know, Abdul Rashid was the assassin of Swami Shraddhanand of the Arya Samaj. And in response to that, Gandhiji had actually refused to acknowledge the man even as an assassin or a criminal, and said, my dear brother Abdul Rashid, and we need to get into the psyche of the assassin and so on. And Shashwat had got quite alarmed by this, is what I read on Twitter. So yeah, I think his question remained unanswered. Of course, you see, these are two, as you'd probably read in the subsequent chapters, Shashwat, that these are two different organizations, the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha. Savarkar was never part of the RSS, and Dr. Hedgewar, who was the founder of the RSS, though there was no enmity as such between the two, there was lots of competitiveness between both of them because they were all operating in the same space. While the equation between Hedgewar and Savarkar was cordial, afterwards, once Guruji Golwalkar became the head of the RSS, there were lots of differences of opinion on whether the Hindu Mahasabha wanted the RSS to be like their Boy Scouts, tied to their apron strings, which the RSS resisted. And the Hindu Mahasabha literally died after the 1946 elections, where they were totally wiped off. And Savarkar, as the former president too, and after his implication in Gandhi's murder, and of course acquittal later, but still constantly that taint that was put that he was part of it ensured that his name somehow withered away. But the RSS kept growing stronger and stronger, because one difference between the two was, while the Hindu Mahasabha was very person-centric, the RSS was more ideology-centric. So if a person rose or fell, the party, the organization also rose and fell. Whereas in the RSS, irrespective of who was the head, the movement would continue. So Hindu Mahasabha, once Savarkar got implicated and imprisoned, it died. Whereas in the case of the RSS, it continued to, and in 100 years, it's going to complete 100 years in another 3 years, in 2025. It's probably going to, it's growing only stronger in the cultural, political, history of India. So that is one reason why I think Dr. Hedgewar is given a lot more importance, or his views are still in currency, because he represents an organization which is still thriving. Savarkar, on the other side, represents someone whom even the Sangh respects and looks up to. But then directly, there are no political successors, so to say, for Savarkar's legacy. And so that is one reason why I think between the two men, as you rightly, very nicely, saw, it's going to be this. This is the reason.
I have also a second question, and that is why was Ambedkar ji so reluctant on sharing the stage with Savarkar on the issue of untouchability and social reform?
My God, look at them at 12. When I was 12, I don't think I had this kind of insight.
He's a serious fan of yours. He's read the book very well.
Wonderful. Yeah. I'm so happy. Yes, that's again a brilliant question. So I think at that time, in those 13 years that Savarkar was in Ratnagiri, from 1924 to 1937, initially, he had come out on a conditional release that I'm not going to participate in politics for 5 years, and I'm not going to go outside Ratnagiri district. Now, this 5 years kept getting extended to every 2 years. When it would come up for review, the government would say this man is having dubious past, because he had a lot of underground involvements with several revolutionaries, even while he was in Ratnagiri, on the outside doing social reforms, but alongside also participating in the revolutionary movement by stealth. So the British never trusted him, and they kept increasing his captivity from 5 to 13 years. So in that interim, obviously a lot of politicians in the mainstream, Ambedkar included, were a little hesitant to associate themselves with him or to be seen with him, because anybody who was seen meeting him, they would also come under the British surveillance. And I think Ambedkar's agenda was also different. His was the emancipation of the depressed classes, also by using political power. So he was a part of the Viceroy's Council later, even during the war years, even during the Quit India movement. Dr. Ambedkar was part of the Viceroy's Council. So it would have also, made his political future very difficult if he was seen to be very closely associated with Savarkar. And so probably that's one reason, though, despite he writes, as you would have read, several letters to Savarkar saying that you are the only person who understands that, the Varna system is the root cause of the Jati Pratha, and that has to go if we have to have a casteless society and all of that. But despite repeated invitations from Savarkar to come and attend, meetings with him, he refuses. Of course, they'll meet much later after he's completely out of jail. But this is probably one reason why nobody wanted to risk their political careers and futures by even being distantly associated with this man, the political untouchable that I had earlier, mentioned.
Thank you, Shashwat.
Thank you, Shashwat. Lovely, and all the best, and may God bless you.
Yes, really. Next, we have Nikhil Pandya. He's in fact working in real estate. He's one of the few people here who's just finished your book, and he's an avid reader and a big fan of yours. Yes, Nikhil.
First of all, Mr. Vikram ji, many congratulations. Just yesterday, I just finished the book.
Oh,
Just yesterday, I just finished. It took around 7 to 8 days for this. And I also took 2 to 3 days holidays for my office.
oh,
And,
wow. Thank you.
Kindly take care of yourself. I just go through about in Twitter. You are very much serious in the COVID-19. I would like to know, we knew about the Savarkar. It's a Swatantra Veer Savarkar. The main behind is Mr. Vaman Rao Joshi. So we don't know about the Vaman Rao Joshi exactly how is he connected with the Savarkar for that. So I would like to know about more about if it is possible then Vaman Rao Joshi about. And secondly, the short question about it. I just would like to know about what is the ideology between Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar as well as Veer Savarkar about untouchability as well as we can say about the caste system, caste system.
So Vaman Rao Joshi, there were actually two people. One, Vaman Rao Joshi, was also the one who was with Savarkar. There were three people in the cellular jail from Maharashtra: Baba Rao, Savarkar's elder brother, then Savarkar himself, and Vaman Rao Joshi. But this Vaman Rao Joshi, who gave him this title, Swatantra Veer, was not that same person. He was a playwright, he was a poet, a journalist, a very erudite person. So when Savarkar came out of jail, lots of public, as you've read in the book, lots of public felicitations kept happening in different parts of Maharashtra, in Nashik, in Bhagur, in Bombay, in Pune, and all those places. And that's where, in a public event, Vaman Rao Joshi had first coined this word, that somebody who has come from the clutches of death. And he was a poet himself, he was a playwright and all of that. So in that flourish, he came out with this name Swatantra Veer. And also that tied up with what the Abhinav Bharat used to have even their letters would start with Swatantra Lakshmi Ki Jai. So that was the symbol that they had of the goddess Lakshmi as the embodiment of independence. So Swatantra Veer was therefore a very important title that was given to him. Later on, another poet called Vaishampayan, a Marathi poet, he also reinforced this and called him the same. And after that, I think that name stuck with him. It's such a travesty that this despite that, people say he gave the title Veer to himself and all of that, which is absolutely untrue. This is a documented fact as to who actually gave him this upadhi. Now to the other question on Ambedkar and Savarkar, I think that's very pertinent, because very few people would know that their views were very similar to each other when it came to matters of caste system and eradication. Now, whether or not you and I believe in it, they believed that the four Varnas were the main, fundamental evil within Hindu society. Of course, Lord Krishna had actually said the Varnas are created by me, not on the basis of gunas and not on the basis of heredity. So everybody is born a Shudra, and then you work yourself up to aspire to become a Brahmin, irrespective of which family you're born into. But then over time, that Varna system had fossilized into heredity and birth, and not through gunas. But the jatis, the upajatis that came out of these four Varnas, so both of these people believed that you had to remove the fundamental evil in the caste system, and it was like a very nihilist kind of an approach, a shattering of the entire society, which was difficult. But Savarkar, I think, went also one step forward and also reminded Ambedkar several times that typically the narrative that we hear is that it is an upper caste versus lower caste, an upper caste oppressing a lower caste thing, which certainly happens. But then he also pointed out that within the so-called lower caste also, there are substratas, and there is, oppression of one who is above the other in the ladder of the caste hierarchy. So he in fact wrote to Ambedkar several times that, Ambedkar belonged to this caste of the Mahars. So there were so many castes who were below that category. whom the Mahars also oppressed. They would not allow, say, I mean, it's a wrong term to use in today's parlance, politically incorrect to say Bhangi, but then Bhangi caste, who would not be allowed into a Mahar Vada, or who could not take water from a Mahar well. So while the Mahars would, get very agitated about the Maratha or the Brahmin who are above them in the hierarchy, but they would also do equal oppression of someone who came below them in the hierarchy. So Savarkar said all of these differences need to be removed if we have to consolidate as a society, and also that Hindu-ness among all of us needs to come through. But their similarity in views when it came, the motivations may have been different. Savarkar was not only just for eradication of caste, but also consolidation of Hindu society for political purposes also, and for numerical strength as well. Whereas Ambedkar was coming from the perspective of someone from the community who was facing that oppression. So both, but the end point for both of them was the same: eradication of caste and equality of opportunity for everybody, whether it was matters of intercaste dining, intercaste marriages, temple entry, common communal celebrations, and all of that. And at the same time, like I mentioned very much in detail, the views of all the three, Savarkar, Ambedkar, and Gandhi. Gandhiji saying, I believe in the Varna system. I don't think it is odious. And I think that Hinduism would break down if the Varna system is dismantled. And also when a group of untouchables go to meet him in 1931 or 32, he says, everybody cannot become a viceroy or a prime minister. You have to be born in a particular family. You have to have the leadership genes in you to actually aspire to become a leader. Yeah.
Thank you, Nikhil, for joining us.
Thank you, Nikhil.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Next, we have Deepak. He's joined in from London. He's a career banker who's worked for over 3 decades with 3 international banks, and he currently works as a consultant in financial markets. Hi, Deepak.
Hi. Thanks, Nita, and good evening, Vikram. It's nice to meet you. And I think it's very, very enlightening to hear you today, actually. You said in your opening statement that some people have intentionally maligned Savarkar. So let me first start by saying I have no political affiliations in India, England, or anywhere in the world. Now, you spent 6 years on your research, and I think I must have spent no more than parts of 6 days of my life reading about Savarkar. And when I was 12, I used to read Enid Blyton and Hardy Boys, never history. So I think, well done, Shashwat. I think you simply rock, and good luck with your book. So, after listening to you, I wasn't sure earlier, but after listening to you, I'll definitely be reading your book. But from what I've read hitherto, I think Savarkar's legacy should be evaluated based on his achievements as a poet, a social reformer, for his bravery, and as a patriot. I think just like your mother, I am a Maharashtrian. So Savarkar, according to me, was an awesome poet, and songs based on his poems sung by Mangeshkar siblings, they kind of whip up a very nationalistic fervor. And 2 of my absolute favorites are Jayastute and Sagara Pranatharmana. So I think lovely songs. So I think you very well articulated on some of the points. I think on social reforms, I've read about the great work he did in bringing about reforms for jail inmates. You touched upon his views on caste system, but if I may add, when he was freed, actually he campaigned to break the system and even built a temple, if I'm not mistaken, for all castes. So another great achievement, I think, way ahead of his times and long before Dr. Ambedkar. Now, I'll definitely give him credit, and I rate him very high as a poet and a social reformer. But you mentioned earlier that you wouldn't rate him as a leader, but I'll go one step further and I'll ask a question. And I'm sorry, it's a bit of an accurate question. I wouldn't rate him very high on bravery and patriotism, where I think he scores low. And I'll make 2-3 points before I ask my question. I think when he was 12, he vandalized a mosque and he was proud about it. So I wouldn't call that bravery. He had hatred for Muslims, which is well known, elaborately documented. And he was intolerant towards minorities. So the last point would be, he formed militant groups, he praised Hitler, he supported fascism, none of which are really ideals of a democratic way of life. So I've got 2 questions for you. My first question is, he openly supported the Brits, opposed Quit India movement, offered military cooperation to the British against Subhash Chandra Bose, opposed the Quit India movement, supported the Brits in World War II. And he never respected or accepted the tricolor. So what qualifies him to be called a freedom fighter? That's one. Second thing is, there were hundreds of freedom fighters who were tortured in Andaman jail. But I think he was the only one, apart from S.A. Dange, who sent mercy petitions, about half a dozen or so. So I think the only petition that Bhagat Singh sent was, shoot me, don't hang me. That's bravery. So why do we call Savarkar Veer when he actually asked the British to pardon him on the premise that he would give up a fight for independence and loyal? So these are the two questions really. One is why we call him a freedom fighter, and why should we call him Veer, according to you? I'll definitely be reading the book for answers, but I just thought on this forum I can ask you.
Yeah, no, wonderful. And I think that would, in those questions and in my attempt to answer it, it would be like giving up the entire, 2 volumes, but I'll try to, summarize as much as possible. Yeah, a lot of this is said, you started off with him vandalizing a mosque while he was a child. Every political leader's life, according to me, is a life in evolution. That way, Gandhiji, while he was in South Africa, even today, people, try to get his statues out off the pedestal that they're put because they consider him racist. The kind of things he said about the blacks, I've mentioned that in my book, what he, actually considered them as. So, but then later on in life, he evolves. As the person evolves, their political ideas also evolve. So similarly, Savarkar, what he did as a 10-year-old child or 12-year-old child, which was a byproduct of the Maharashtra of that time, where even a Tilak that way wrote very, very strident articles against what he called as the British appeasement of the Muslims and all the conflicts that came between the two communities on matters of cow slaughter or procession, music processions in front of mosques and so on. And so that by that same standards, even a Kesari or a Tilak would today be considered as being very communal minded. So, but that was the situation, the social situation in Maharashtra in the 1890s was such where there was deep suspicion about a particular group, more so when that particular group was also indulged in extraterritorial allegiances, like during the Khilafat movement for the establishment of a caliphate in Turkey. And they would actually barter their support to the freedom movement in return to support for the caliphate, which should not have mattered much to Indians fighting for the cause of freedom. So all these suspicions are a product of those times. We need to see, I think, history and historical characters in that context, and then that starts making sense. Because by today's standards, some of Ambedkar's writings on Islam or on Muslims, probably Savarkar pales in comparison by the kind of things that Ambedkar had said, that Islam is a closed corporation, that an Indian Muslim can never be loyal to this land because he would always consider this as the Darul Harab, and so there's always this fighting that has to happen and all of that. So, but then we don't call an Ambedkar an Islamophobe by today's definitions, because those were the times when there were things happening where a vivisection of the subcontinent was being called upon, because of which people reacted, and these were political beings who reacted in the way they did. But I think the document that he and his party brought out in their vision for an India of the future, the Hindu Rashtra that they thought of, I think that is what to me is more important than what he did as a 12-year-old child, where in his speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, later on also in that constitution of the free Hindustan state, which the Hindu Mahasabha came up with in 1945, 5 years before the actual constitution of India was drafted, where they said there's going to be no state religion in free Hindustan or any of its provinces. The minorities, it's normally believed that he thought they were second-rate citizens and all of that, which is not true at all. That's also a misunderstanding, because he had said in his speeches that there need not even be a ghost of suspicion in the minds of the minorities of India, that their legitimate religious, cultural, and linguistic rights would be infringed upon by the state. And the majority would not get any extra, privileges only because they're more in number, and vice versa. The minorities also will not get any extra concessions only because they're less in number. Everybody is going to be equal in the eyes of the law, and the state could also go ahead and fund minority institutions, churches, madrasas, or whatever else. But there also the amount of money that is received by these groups would be proportional to the amount of taxes they pay to the national exchequer. So if a community is useful to the country, they'll be supported. But if they're a liability, then you will not be. So, so this often, described version of him as this bigot who was actually waiting to swallow up all the minorities, or the Hindu Rashtra being that, I think that's also a little bit of an exaggeration. It was not that. There was suspicion. There was this sense that this group was planning to vivisect the country. And so that's, as I said, whether it was Ambedkar or Savarkar, they were all responding to this, and one needs to look at it in that context. Now, to the other question that you spoke about, the freedom struggle, that comes back to my question, my earlier statement, that there was really no one freedom struggle, as we are made to believe. It's almost like a Attenborough film that we are always taught in our history books, that from one satyagraha to the other, that was how the freedom struggle proceeded. And anybody who is not part of that is a traitor. So in fact, the 1942, since you specifically mentioned Quit India, the Quit India movement was something that people in the Congress themselves opposed. Maulana Azad, who was the president of the Congress at that time, I quote him copiously in the book, where he has a huge difference of opinion with Gandhi, to the extent that Gandhi says, you need to leave the Congress if you don't, agree to me. So it was the president of the Congress at the time when this movement was being launched who opposed it. Jawaharlal Nehru was opposed to the movement initially. Rajagopalachari, who was one of Gandhi's most trusted allies, he also found Gandhi's suggestion to the British that you leave India, but leave your army behind, which would have made India into a huge military base for America and Britain and so on to actually, fight the war. We would have been like what Afghanistan is today, if there was no civilian power, but only military power left behind, and we become the battlefield in Asia. That was Gandhi's vision, which even Rajagopalachari said this would lead to establishment of the worst form of British imperialism. So there were lots of people who were opposed to it. The movement really had no planning. I mentioned the exact sequence of events as to why it started, how it failed within 3 months of its launch in 1942. And so across the political spectrum, there was hardly any support for the Quit India movement. And the biggest, irony is the Congress itself disowned themselves from this movement. Today, everybody is taking a lot of credit for this, but the Congress then itself disowned themselves from the movement for the simple reason that, since there was no plan of action, there was no agenda, there was this do or die that was given out as a statement. Now, what that meant was different things for different people. And so the Quit India movement became a very, very bloody, violent, movement, much to the discomfort of the non-violent principles that Gandhi had fought for. If you remember, just when a police station was set on fire in Chauri Chaura, the entire non-cooperation movement was called back. But here was a movement which was no less than an internal rebellion. And most of these people who opposed it were also opposing it on the reason that Japan was going to attack us on our borders at that time. It was not prudent to actually create so much of unrest within the country, is what most of them thought of. Ambedkar called it a treachery to the nation, and he urged all Indians not to participate in the civil disobedience that Gandhi was launching. And within 3 days of the launching of the movement, Gandhi and the entire Congress was put in jail. So it was a leaderless movement which failed, as I said, within 3 months. So in that context, again, we see Savarkar and the Hindu Mahasabha also being opposed to the Quit India movement. But were they actually in support of the British? Now, that also is a big story, which is mentioned in the book, where they were playing a Jekyll and Hyde with the British. On the one hand, they were actually dealing. Now, we need to decide. On the one hand, we say he supported Hitler and he was a pro-Nazi person and so on. On the other side, we say he was pro-British. Now, Hitler and the British were enemies. So whose side was Savarkar? Was he on both sides? Can we call him pro-British or can we call him pro-Nazi? Because he can't be the same, both at the same time, which the Hindu Mahasabha was actually playing that double game. They were trying to be on the high table of negotiations with the Viceroy, which hitherto was reserved only for the Congress and the Muslim League, saying we are the true voice of the Hindu community and we need to also secure a place at the table. But another important reason for him to support the war efforts was to militarize the Indian army with Hindus. because Ambedkar also again underlines this in his book, where he says by the time of the World War, the communal composition of the Indian army was extremely skewed. Almost it had 60% Muslims, and the percentage of the Hindus in the army was steadily falling. And he himself writes, Ambedkar writes, that they've become the gatekeepers of India. Can we really trust these gatekeepers when co-religionists are going to attack from Afghanistan side? This is a reason to alarm the Hindus enough to kind of do something about it, and so on. And so this whole idea of militarization or Sainikikaran that was launched was precisely for this reason, that to create a balance, because everybody knew by then that the British were going to leave at some point. And in the eventuality of them leaving, what would happen to the nation they'd leave behind? Would there be a civil war, which eventually there was a civil war? And in the eventuality of that civil war, one community is completely armed. It is in position of strength in the army, in military strength. Another community is completely made pusillanimous because they've been taught this whole idea of non-violence. So in such a case, what is it? What would happen to a community which is at this disadvantage? So this was the whole idea of also wanting to militarize and therefore join the British Army, train yourself in military warfare. But contrary to what you mentioned, it was not to be used against Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose or the INA. A lot of the Indians who joined the British Indian Army on the behest of Savarkar's advice actually defected over to the INA. And Netaji himself mentions this in one of his address, that we got a lot of feeder, circuit of soldiers from those people who Savarkar, recruited into the army. And in fact, I also quote a couple of letters, in fact, of soldiers of the INA. When the INA trials were being held in 1946, they said, we joined the British Indian Army on the advice of Savarkar and later switched over. Now, throughout the period from 1857 to 1946, the revolutionary movement in India was based on this very premise, that how can we infiltrate the Indian army? How can we cause a Bagawat, a revolt within that, which would ensure that the empire actually collapses? Because there were 2.5 million Indian soldiers during the Second World War, and they were controlled by about 40,000 European overlords in the army I'm talking about. So even if 5% or 10% of this 2.5 million they're able to seduce them to patriotism and bring them over to the side of the struggle and cause a mutiny in the army, that was a specter that the British were mortally scared of. They wanted to avoid a repetition of 1857 at any cost. And in fact, the Congress too was established as that safety wall to ensure that there is no repeat of the 1857. You can keep an engagement with the Indian elite so that there is no repeat of 1857 that happens, which the revolutionaries were opposed to that. They said just by taking marches and this and that, nothing is going to happen. Of course, it creates a sense of nationalism and mass awakening, desire for freedom, but the actual freedom happens only when there is a revolt in the army. And that was also what Savarkar envisaged right in 1900s when he formed the Abhinav Bharat, in which the whole idea was based on the Italian revolutionaries, Mazzini and Garibaldi, who had very similar ideas for young Italy. How do you infiltrate the army and create an internal revolt? And contrary to, again, what people think that, he betrayed Subhash Chandra Bose. In fact, the founder of the INA, Rash Bihari Bose, he was an ardent supporter of Savarkar. And in fact, he started a Hindu Mahasabha chapter in Japan where he was, and he considered Savarkar as his leader. And in fact, when Netaji visits Savarkar in Bombay in 1940, it said that is when he told him, he had actually come to Savarkar to discuss, by then he had broken away from the Congress. So he had formed this forward bloc and he wanted to create a civil disobedience in the country through the forward bloc. And it is Savarkar who advised him, saying, nothing is going to be achieved by staying in the country and doing all these dharnas and so on. You're just going to sit and rot in jail. Instead, what you go and do is better go and ally with the enemies of our enemy, who's going to be our friend. And so he showed him the letters of correspondence between him and Rash Bihari Bose, and also made that connection and ensured that Subhash Chandra Bose escaped to Germany first. And Hitler's army had an India Independence Legion, which actually was working for the liberation of India. And so if being, a close ally of Hitler is a bad stick to beat Savarkar with, Subhash Chandra Bose would be the biggest fascist, as we would call him, because he was right there in Hitler's army. He met Hitler. He was part of the German, army legions, and then later on moved to Southeast Asia and led the INA, which Raj Bihari Bose had formed. So I think these different parallel streams that were going on, and these threads that we need to connect, which have never been told to us at all, because as I said, the story that proceeds is a very, very simple story. One movement to the other movement, 1921, the Dandi March, then the Quit India movement, and so on. Anybody could argue, if 1942, the Quit India movement was really so effective, did it take 5 years for the British to consider leaving after that? They would have immediately collapsed and left the next day. They were so scared that so many people were coming on streets and saying, quit India, quit India. So, nobody is going to take that seriously. Today, farmers are sitting for 1 year on the outskirts of Delhi. The government of India is not budging. Why would a non-violent struggle like this make the mightiest empire of this country budge? Of course, it was a big thorn in their flesh nonetheless, but the eventual decision to leave India was not caused by this. And this is not something I am saying, but the then Prime Minister of Britain, Clement Attlee, who had signed the transfer of power to India, I think after independence, he comes to India in 1952 or 53 to Calcutta. And he has this discussion with the governor of Bengal, who was also the judge of the Calcutta High Court, who asks him, Mr. Attlee, why did you leave India so quickly? What is it that prompted you to leave the country and give us independence? Because none of us expected that it would happen so suddenly. And to which Attlee himself is supposed to have said, and these are documented in his memoirs, the judge's memoirs, that he said it was the INA, it was the impact of the naval mutiny in Bombay in 1946, and we were really scared of a repeat of what happened in 1857, where the British were slaughtered, men, women, children, in the 1857 uprising. So we didn't want that to happen. So Mountbatten was literally given this farman that rescue whatever is there from the wreckage and come back safe and sound. And then the same judge also asks Clement Attlee, what was the impact of Gandhi's movement, particularly Quit India, on your final decision to leave? And with a smirk, he says, minimal. So this was coming from the British Prime Minister himself, and 6 years after freedom. So he really had nothing to, gain by disparaging Gandhi or by elevating Subhash Chandra Bose. He was just probably stating a matter of fact, which has not been told to us time and again, that the reasons why we got our independence after 75 years, we as a nation don't even know that clearly, or who are the people who are behind that. We've been made to create or believe in a very make-believe kind of a charade that this was the reason, or this was the journey of our freedom struggle. I think time has come, as I said, we're a mature democracy now, where we can look at all the different aspects of the freedom struggle and evaluate the contribution of different people. One small point I'd also add to the petitions. I think I've spoken about it ad infinitum, but then just one word. I mean, a prisoner cannot choose the punishment that he or she gets. Some people were given the harshest punishment of execution. Now, someone else, like Savarkar, was given the harshest living punishment, which was of 2 life imprisonments, which meant 25 plus 25, 50 years in jail. Now, a young man who was 27 when he was imprisoned is supposed to rot in jail for 50 years. Now, what use would he be to the country by rotting in jail? So most of the political prisoners who wrote petitions, including someone like a Sachindranath Sanyal, would write these petitions saying, we will abide by the British law, we will not take part in politics, we will be nice and good. But even the British knew that these petitions were not worth the paper they were written on. They never trusted, because Sanyal wrote such a petition, came out and started the HRA, which led to the Kakori case. And later he again got jailed and came back and so on. So these petitions were a very tactical and a strategic, I don't call them mercy petition, because nowhere in those petitions is there an apology saying, I'm sorry for what I did. It is just that this is the way a political prisoner could lodge a petition to come out. Just as you have a bail application today, you put that and come out so that you can be of use to the country, because rotting in jail for 50 years would mean that you're actually doing nothing for the country. So many prisoners were being let out normally with a general amnesty. These main leaders, whether it was Barin Ghosh, the Anushilan Samiti, or Savarkar, the Abhinav Bharat, these were leaders of their movements. They were given the opportunity to file petitions. The others were being let out even without filing a petition by the general amnesty principle and the royal proclamation of Emperor George V during the change of capital to New Delhi and all of that from Calcutta. So I think that context again of the petitions becomes very important to know what this context was of why they had to do it and what was the motivation behind it. I'm sorry for a very long answer.
No, Vikram, I think it was very useful, and I'm definitely going to read the book, because you made some points which obviously I was not aware of. So I definitely need to read the book to understand a little bit more. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you,
Deepak. And Vikram, you've done the onerous task of deciphering the enigma of Savarkar, whose name still echoes in the political system of today. And as you've said before, that in the politics of right and left, history becomes a catchword. So now we have Arushi. She's a research center analyst at a sustainability firm, and she's a history enthusiast and hopes to publish her work one day. Arushi.
Hi, Vikram. My question is a little bit writer specific. So, as a historian and as someone who has, done rigorous, unbiased research on Savarkar, how do you feel, how do you feel and or deal with absolutely factually incorrect and tendentious views written about him?
That's a very good question. Very, sometimes it's very irritating, but you need to keep a straight face and still keep repeating like a parrot the same kind of things in different ways. No, some things like, maybe people don't know. So a lot of it, when it comes out of genuine lack of understanding or lack of knowledge, for the simple reason that these are not documented facts, these are not someone who's amenable to facts if presented to them, then it's worth repeating the same thing 100 times also. But if one is motivated and if one has an agenda that, the other side may give you 10 reasons, 10 logical arguments, but still I will continue to say what I want to say, then there's no point. Bhains ke aage been bajana. So there's no point trying to, show facts or documents to such people. But yeah, I think it's very frustrating that on social media, I keep seeing this all the time, that I may have given a 2-hour lecture on the life of Savarkar, where I've talked about the petitions and all of that. And then there's one loony person who will then write in 240 characters, par wo to maafi veer tha, or something like that. And then I'm like, oh my God, it's like the full Ramayana you've heard. And then you ask how are Ram and Sita related to each other. That is very frustrating, which also shows that there's no attention to detail at all. You have fixed ideas, which cannot be shaken. And that's a little sad. You can't really help them at all.
Kabir Dev, he's the author and lecturer of neurobiology from Assam. Yes, Kabir, a short question, please. Because I hope.
Hello, Vikram sir.
Hello. Good to finally see you, Kabir.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you. It's an honor also. I have completed the book. Yeah. So this whole the two books are completed. So I just had the question that now when we see the present India, we see the country in a very volatile state, or in a very extremist fashion. We see even the progressive individuals see the country in a very binary manner. There is in the right and left. So whenever we quote Savarkar, either as a bigot or as a person who signed a mercy petition, or someone who is a progressive individual, just like you portrayed it. So how would we actually make the liberals think about Savarkar, about how you actually see him, and how do you actually think that those who are these extremists, they follow Savarkar? And if not, then how would you make Savarkar available to them? Because they actually do not know who Savarkar is, because the acts they are doing is completely against Savarkar's ideology. So, but they're still using the name of Savarkar. So I just wanted to ask you that.
Who exactly are you referring to when you say extremists? You mean
anyone who those the mob lynching and everything that happened in our country in the name of Savarkar. So whenever these things happen, we usually try to portray it in the saffron color, but it's actually not the case. It's actually not the case. It's a very holistic thing happening, and it's a very binary thing happening, because whenever something very atrocious happens in our state, the so-called liberals try to quote them in the color of saffron, but without understanding what is happening. So how do you actually make them understand that Savarkar is not actually responsible, rather these individuals are responsible? So there is the question.
Yeah. No, that's a good question, because inherent in that is the fact that when you say so-called liberals, I think a liberal would be somebody whom was it Robert Frost who said that a liberal is one who would argue against himself in a debate. That's the kind of openness to views that a person needs to have to be qualified as a liberal. Whereas today we use this, we hyphenate this term as left liberal, whereas I don't know if that is the right thing to do, because as I even mentioned to Arushi, those who have made up their mind not to be amenable to any kind of facts or fossilized kind of thought process, nothing, any amount of drums that are beaten are not going to shake or wake up such people. So it's okay, these things continue. But I think a lot of others who would see the facts speaking for themselves, the records speaking for themselves, I think they would have a very different view. So whether it is, even in, you mentioned mob lynching, which happens in the name of the cow, and of course that's also a very monochromatic, one-sided picture we see, that all cow vigilantism is violent. There are numerous stories of how those who are trying to protect the cow, they have lost their lives too, and those stories we seldom hear, because cow is of course an important article of faith for several Hindus, but it's also very important from the rural economy point of view. So just as if someone kidnaps your pet dog or something, and then you're going to get very violent and try to get behind the person who's kidnapping it, something similar is happening in the rural hinterland. So not all the time it is a communal issue. It could be as simple as theft, a law and order problem, and all of that, in which, as you rightly said, this painting of the picture that it's all religion driven, it's a communal agenda that keeps getting drawn in, and worse, people like Savarkar's name also invoked. But the best antidote to ignorance is through illumination of knowledge. And so when one reads what he said about all these issues, what he thought about how a human life is much more important than an animal's life, and so on, I think then reality will speak for itself, and these false allegations will then just wear off. But things that are done with a political motive, political agenda, then it's very difficult to sort that out in any case, and that would be for the political parties and their spokespersons to deal with, not with boring historians like myself.
Thank you, Kabir.
Thank you.
One last question we'll take, I think, Vikram, because you might be really tired. Now we have Vijay Shankar. He's an advocate, and he has one question from you.
I have two questions, if you allow me. My
Sure.
first question is, would it be fair to judge our freedom fighters in a binary? I mean, why do we judge them? Why do we desist from exploring the human element in them? My second question, if you allow me, is that V.D. Savarkar ji was honorably acquitted in the Mahatma Gandhi murder case.
Yeah.
I'm myself a lawyer, and I'm myself a criminal lawyer, and he was honorably acquitted. The government of the day chose not to appeal against that acquittal.
Yeah.
Even then, many people still link him with the Mahatma Gandhi murder case. So how do you explain this position? The government of the day choosing not to challenge his acquittal. Yet the
Yeah.
same people or the successors of the same party which led the government of the day, they yet link them to the murder case.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think, yeah, that's just political opportunism that, you need to beat a person for contemporary political gains. So if you have to have an axe to grind with the current political party or with the current prime minister, then you kind of shoot at his alleged, ideological ancestor. Like you said, he was acquitted in the 1949 Red Fort trial. But more importantly, as I've also pointed out in the book, in 2016, as late as 5 years ago, there was a public interest litigation that was filed in the Bombay High Court on, of course, that this gentleman called Dr. Pankaj Phadnis who had filed this. It was on several counts. There was also a conspiracy theory he was trying to put out on Gandhi's murder, saying, the Americans and the Brits were behind it, etc., etc. And but also one contention, because there were 4 bullets, there were whereas Nathuram Godse had only fired 3. So what was the 4th bullet doing? And I'm not getting into that aspect. That will be a huge discussion. But the other aspect that he brought out was that the Kapoor Commission had named Savarkar without any corroborative evidence, without actually even looking at the people who were his the main witnesses who had testified under police coercion. His secretary Gajanand Damle and the bodyguard Appa Kasar, they were not called upon either by the trial court in Delhi nor by the Kapoor Commission, which had called 101 witnesses. But these 2 important people on whose testimony the approver's statement, Digambar Badge's statement of Yashasvi Hoon Ya, be successful and come back, which he said to allegedly to Godse and Apte, that whole edifice of the prosecution case stood, that those people were not called upon. So this man, Dr. Phadnis, had filed this PIL in the Bombay High Court. The Bombay High Court dismissed it. It was then taken up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually took cognizance of this. And for I think 1 year, an amicus curiae was appointed to go through the entire case documents, of the murder trial, and also the Kapoor Commission report, the testimonies and evidence. For 1 year, the amicus curiae went through it, and at the end of it, the bench, which was led by the former Chief Justice of India, none less than that, Justice Bobde and Justice Nageshwar Rao, they gave this verdict that the petitioner's contention that Savarkar has been implicated or his name is implicated in the murder through the Kapoor Commission is misplaced. The commission does not have the jurisdiction to overthrow the verdict of a trial court. So the fact that he's not even here to represent himself or defend himself, it's unfair to him. And so the earlier verdict of his acquittal remains. And so all these contentions that he was part of it, it does not hold. So forget the acquittal of 1949. In 2018, 3 years ago, we've had this from this highest court of the country. But despite that, time and again, for narrow political gains, for election speeches, this keeps getting dragged. And then the best way that everyone can do is, like what Mr. Ranjit Savarkar, his grandnephew, does, which is to take them all to court on defamation cases. And so that's what is going to happen. And a lot of lawyers will have a lot of work to kind of defend one party against the other. And so I think
finally a breach will be created.
Yeah, that's a sad casualty of this whole thing, where history becomes a joke, where I think after the highest court of the country has exonerated someone, it's good to let the matter to rest forever. But that's not to be in this country, sadly.
Sir, my first question was regarding the binaries. Like what we have seen that Savarkar ji or any other freedom fighter for that moment, there have been attempts till date to paint them in black and white, like in binaries, that they were a traitor, or they were collaborators for British Empire, or they were freedom fighters, they were violent or non-violent whatsoever. But the fact is that you have to see the historical characters, especially the freedom fighters, in their human self.
Very
They're
true.
blood and flesh.
Very
Like
true.
Shivaji Maharaj, who led such a long struggle against the Mughals, he went on to serve as the Mughal Mansabdar for quite some time, along with his son Shambhaji. He appeared in the court of Aurangzeb Alamgir. Did
True.
Cornoush to him only when he was insulted there as a Sardar. He escaped from there, whatever it was. But the fact was that they were all hard-headed realists.
Yeah.
They all happened to serve the same empires which they fought later on.
Very true.
So why do we desist from painting our freedom fighters in their human form?
Yeah, no, that's I mean, it's just that we in India love to make idols of people and hero worship, land of hero worshippers that we are. So our leaders can make no mistakes. So there has to be one hero, there has to be an anti-hero, not realizing that I don't think life is like that of blocks of black and white. I think there's lots of more than 50 shades of gray when it comes to human lives, and that we don't recognize. And to even, so like the instances I mentioned of, say, Dr. Ambedkar. So just for the fact that, say, an Arun Shourie wrote, in his book, Worshipping False Gods, where he questioned all of this. I mean, in 1942, Ambedkar was part of the Viceroy's Council. There was not even a single time Ambedkar went to jail. He also called Quit India a treachery against the country. But today, anybody calls Ambedkar a stooge of the British, then, you are going to have it, because he's a politically very, rife kind of a character. And so you can't afford to, so he's painted in such a way that the hero cannot be touched. Now, Gandhi, to beyond a point, it can't be touched. So a lot of these failings, and as you rightly said, they're human nature. They were not superhuman. They were not gods. Even in our tradition, even gods fail. So where gods also get shraps. But in our historical discourse, we make such superhumans of our historical figures that we don't attribute anything wrong to them. And that's a huge problem. We need to humanize them and make them people whom we can relate to.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to get on here, sir, and say that your conversation today has been very enriching. And every time that I listen to you, all the interviews and your book, I learned so much more. So thank you so much for that. Specifically for so patiently answering all the questions. We tried to take as many questions from the chat as possible. But thank you so much. This was very, very enriching. And I would definitely, I'm in the middle of the book, so I want to complete the book as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Neeta and to Shreya, to everyone who's joined. Neeta, it's always such a pleasure to be a part of your discussion, where I think we can go on like Akhand Ramayana all through the night with lots of discussions, but I think time is a big constraint. It shows also the kind of group that you both have built, which is so important to bring writers and readers together. I think that's such an important service that you're doing to the cause of literature, and kudos to you. And 51 may it become 1051 very soon. And
Nice
so
of you. Thank you so much. And I must say here that this book indeed is an epic research work. It is exhaustive, no doubt, but brilliant. So everyone should read it. It has been published by Penguin. It is available in bookstores. You can always order on Amazon. And Vikram, thanking you is never enough. Thank you for gracing our platform. It has been an enriching and knowledgeable session. Really a treat, Vikram. My chat box is already there, and people have not stopped compliments for the lovely conversation that we've had. Putting up this video very, very shortly. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, Vikram. Thanks to the audience. Thank you, everyone.